Welcome to the Adopt Well podcast, where we discuss helpful topics for anyone touched by adoption. I'm your host, Amy Bagwell, here with my co-host, friend, and fellow adoptive mama, Macy Peralt. On today's show, we'll be discussing embryo adoption with Rebekah Heilman. But before we dive into her story, we want to give you some basic information to keep in mind during today's show. We realize that not everyone is familiar with embryo adoption, so please listen as our sweet friend Elizabeth gives us a quick overview of what embryo adoption is.
Hey friends, my name is Elizabeth Bordeaux. I'm one of the founders of Quiverful Adoptions. We offer embryo adoption services to hopeful adoptive families. I'm going to tell you a few facts and answer some frequently asked questions before the show begins. An embryo is an unborn human life in the process of development. It's classified as an embryo from approximately the 2nd to the 8th week after conception. At Quiverful and Adopt Well, we believe life starts at conception, so we believe that these little lives, although preborn, matter. Embryo adoption occurs when a couple who has undergone in vitro fertilization, or IVF, has additional embryos they do not wish to use, or cannot use. At times, these embryos are biologically related to both parts, mother and father, of a couple who underwent IVF. However, in other situations, donor egg and or sperm were used. This can get really confusing, but hang with me. If a family has leftover embryos, they can do one of three things. They can 1, discard them, 2, donate them to science, or 3, donate them to an adoptive family who will use them to try and grow their family. Donating embryos does not cost anything. This process is actually legally referred to as a transfer of property, not adoption. However, since we believe life starts at conception, we believe it should be called adoption, and that's what we're going to continue to refer to it as. You can adopt embryos through a fertility clinic or through some adoption agencies. As with all adoptions, it's vital to do your research on best practices and ethics to make sure you're working with professionals who are doing it well. After the embryo is legally and physically transferred to the adoptive mother or family, it's then implanted into the uterus of either the hopeful mother or a surrogate. If all goes well, she becomes pregnant and births a baby or babies that she has no biological relation to. The average cost of embryo adoption in the United States is $15,000. If you're interested in learning more about adopting or donating your embryos, Quiverful would love to talk with you about how we can help you. You can visit our website at www.quiverfuladoptions.com, as well as find our information in the show notes.
Well, hey friends, this is Macy. Welcome back. We're so excited that you guys are joining us for another episode. So, Rebekah, before we dive into the questions, would you just share a little bit of your story with us?
Thank you guys for having me. My name is Rebekah, as they said, and I live in Concord, North Carolina, and I have been married for 12 years. My husband and I have 3 children. We have twins that are 8.5, and our youngest is about to be 5.
Oh.
Yes, it grows so fast.
5 is an emotional birthday.
I agree.
I can only imagine.
It's a tough one.
It is. So we started off, and I always tell people that when my husband and I first started dating, we had some very key conversations. I was a little bit older. I was 27 at the time, and I kind of knew what I wanted, and I was ready to move on. And so I think within our second or third date, I told him that I felt called to adopt at some point in my life.
That's good for you.
And
get it on out there.
Yes. And if he wasn't on board with that, this wasn't going to go any further for us. And he was a little taken back by that, of course.
I love it.
But I just felt called that at some point that's what God wanted us to do. And he didn't have to be on board right then, but at some point I wanted him to be.
Yeah.
And so I think we started off with the rosy, idea of having a family at some point. And so when we started to try to start a family, we didn't think there would be any problems. We figured it would be just like everybody else we knew.
Oh, yep. I've been there.
Yes. And so, a year into that, and things weren't going the way we thought. And so we started to do some investigation. And I think when you get that infertility diagnosis, it rocked our world.
Yeah.
I don't think that it changed us.
Yeah.
It just changed us. But it didn't break us.
Yes, I get that.
And
Yes.
so we had this long list of different options, some of them very medical in nature. And then at the very end of that list, given, shockingly enough, by our infertility specialist, was adoption.
Wow.
Cool.
I know.
That's amazing.
I was a little shocked at
Yeah.
that. You think they're going to give you just some medical
Yeah,
options.
for
but
sure.
Adoption was at the end of that list.
Wow.
Yes. And so we started to look over all of those different options. And for us, you know, the medical portion of that would have been long and drawn out, and there was no guarantees. And there's no guarantees in life with anything we get.
Yeah.
But we knew adoption was already something that we were called to do at some point. And so we thought, let's just dive into what that looks like, even though that's daunting and it's expensive and it's long. And there's so many ups and downs with that. We thought, let's just go ahead and look into that option. And so we did. Along with that, at the time, I was volunteering at one of the local pregnancy resource centers here in the city of Charlotte. And I had a friend there who was an adoption specialist. And she said to me one day, she said, Rebekah, have you ever heard of embryo adoption? And I said, I haven't. What is this you're talking about? And so we just kind of started researching that. And that's kind of where God led us. And it's been an amazing journey.
That's cool. I know we talked a little about this earlier before we started the show, but your story really resonates with me with the infertility and pursuing the options and all of that. But embryo adoption has always been really intriguing to me. And I looked into that, you know, a good bit before we decided which route we would take. But I hope to talk with you about how all of your children came into your family. But for the sake of today's episode, tell us a little bit about the decision, like you said, to adopt embryos. Like, well, how did that conversation go? Was it you were learning about it, or you just felt a sudden peace about it? What happened from the time of like, okay, so we've heard about embryo adoption. Yes, we want to do it. All right, let's go from there. What did that look like?
So it looked like a lot of research and a lot of praying for sure.
Yeah.
You know, and at the end of the day, for my husband and I, biology wasn't important for us.
Yeah.
And we just wanted to be parents, and we didn't matter how we got there. And so when we started looking into embryo adoption, you know, one of the things that really made it something that we really wanted to pursue was that I got to experience pregnancy.
Yeah.
And, you know, for me, being a woman, you know, pregnancy and birth and being a mama is just kind of it. You know, you feel like you've arrived.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I thought to myself, and I told my husband, I said, you know, if I can experience being pregnant, I'd love to.
Yeah.
But I also said, if I can't, I'm good with that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that when infertility is the start of how your path leads towards adoption, you have to always be okay with where you are, and you have to prepare yourself for each of those phases, and you have to work through each of those phases. And so I was okay if I didn't get to experience pregnancy, but if I wanted to try.
Yeah.
And so for us, that was a big reason that we decided that we wanted to pursue embryo adoption. Additionally, with the cost, it's a lot less expensive than a domestic or international adoption.
Yeah.
And so we thought, let's try that and see where that leads us.
Definitely. That's awesome.
I love it.
So once you and your husband decided on embryo adoption, where did you guys go from there? Did you start like researching agencies? Where did you go next?
So that's a great question. There's so much information that, is all wrapped up in embryo adoption. So we just got on the internet and we just researched and did some more. And because, you know, there wasn't anybody we knew that even knew about it, let alone had actually gone through with that. So we didn't have any friends that we could talk to about their journey with embryo adoption. It was just kind of, we were on this island of trying to figure this out on our own. And so you don't have to go through an agency in order to adopt embryos. You can go, some infertility clinics have donation of embryos from other couples. And so that's always an option for people. There's a lot of embryo donation clinics across the country as well. For us, we wanted a little bit more involvement
Yeah.
And so that's why we chose an agency route.
Okay. Okay, so I was really interested in this. So from the time that you chose the agency, how does that work? Obviously, Macy and I are more familiar with traditional adoption where you are matched and all that. What does that look like, or what did it look like for you guys?
So when you choose an agency for embryo adoption, it mirrors a lot like a domestic or international adoption, which for us gave us some security and some familiar, territory, which we really felt like we wanted and needed at that point.
Yeah.
And so we sent our application in just like we would have. After we were accepted, our application was sent in August. We started a home study, and there's a home study that's required with the agency, just like there would be for any other type of adoption.
Cool.
And so we had all that, encompasses a home study, which for us was the first time, and it was super scary. And I was like, oh my goodness, they're going to come with this white glove, and they're going to go to my baseboards.
Right.
Are they dirty or are they clean?
Thing. I thought the exact same thing. And it's not that at all.
It's not that at all. No. It was not scary in the slightest.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we did a profile just like we would, again, with a traditional adoption. So we created a profile of my husband and I, and we put that out there. And we were matched in December.
Wow.
We were chosen in December.
So from the time you were matched, how did that look up until the time you got pregnant?
That was not what I expected, I'll be honest.
Okay.
So we actually adopted 5 embryos from the couple that chose us, and they were frozen for 5 years.
Wow.
That is so
That'll
crazy.
blow your mind.
I know.
Yes. Yeah, it blows a lot of people's minds.
Yeah.
And especially when you meet our kids and you think about that and you put that into perspective that they were frozen for 5 years before.
It's like mind-boggling to me
is.
of how that actually is possible, but it obviously is.
Yeah.
Yes. And so then once we got everything set up with my clinic and the clinic where they were frozen, they put them in I don't know what they store them in, but they shipped them FedEx.
That is crazy.
So crazy.
FedEx definitely needs to do a commercial about that.
I know. It's so funny because my mom used to joke about what we would tell the girls when they got older about where they came from. And she said, I think you're just going to have to say FedEx delivered them.
That is hilarious.
Yeah. And so there was a lot of medical preparation for me. And that was the portion that I wasn't expecting. I knew in the back of my mind that in order for this to happen and for a pregnancy to actually come about, that would need to take place.
Yeah.
But I don't think that the intensity with which all of that was going to happen, I fully understood at all. And it's not because my doctors didn't prepare me for it, but we didn't really go through any infertility treatments because that really wasn't an option for us. And so we hadn't been down any of those roads. And this was a little similar to some of that medically. And so that was very intense for a couple months while they tried that. And then our transfer was on May 7th.
Okay.
They have to thaw the embryos prior to the transfer. And of the 5 that we adopted, 1 didn't survive the thaw. Mm-hmm. 2 of them did. And actually 3 of them survived the thaw. 1 of them survived, but it wasn't really a quality in which they felt like they could transfer at the time. So they were going to let it develop and see if it became a quality embryo to transfer.
Gotcha.
So the day of the transfer, we're sitting there with the embryologist on May 7th, 2010. And she says, okay, how many embryos are we transferring today? Oh. And I said 3.
Oh, wow.
And she says, no,
we
are not.
Oh, my gosh.
Oh,
and I said, well, why not? And she said, because these quality of these embryos looks too good for us to be able to transfer 3. And we could potentially end up with triplets. So if you want to do 3, I won't do this transfer today. And I said, 2 it is.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm on the table.
I'll take 2.
Right,
2
for
it
real.
is.
You're ready to go.
We just wanted to maximize our chances right out of the starting gate.
Yeah,
Right. And
which
you don't
I understand.
Macy and I say this all the time about adoption, but really it goes for so many things. But you really don't know what you don't know.
Right.
Totally.
Yeah.
Even down to being on the table.
Yes. So on the day of the transfer, we got a really cool look that most people will never get. So we got to look at our babies. You know, we believe that life begins at conception. And
Right.
so for us, those are babies.
Yeah.
And so we got to look at them under a microscope and see them in formation as an embryo before they actually transferred that. And we have a picture of that we have kept for them.
Wow.
That literally just gave me chills.
So amazing.
It was incredibly cool.
Wow.
That is awesome. So I know there are a lot of reasons why people will choose embryo adoption, and obviously they vary, but from what I've gathered, it seems like there are really two major ones. And the first one being that they have a strong desire to experience pregnancy, like you said, and the bonding with the child in utero, and even to be able to experience birth. And then the second one being so that they can have more control over the environment in which the child is developing in utero. So it's all so interesting to me. Can you tell us what it was like being pregnant, bonding, giving birth to them, all of that?
Pregnancy for us was a roller coaster.
Yeah.
You know, I had never experienced that before, and so I didn't know what to expect, of course. Most first-time mamas don't. But right out of the starting gate for us, they thought I had a blood clot in my lungs.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, that was probably 9 weeks. So because of how the route that we chose, you know, we knew what the transfer date was, so we know what that 2-week, you know, wait was like, which was brutal, by the way.
I
can't.
bet.
Brutal.
I cannot.
But then the numbers came back and we were pregnant and we were overjoyed. The numbers were really, really high, and so they couldn't guarantee us that meant that they had both attached and we were pregnant with twins, but it looked favorable that we were. And so, you know, we had a lot more appointments at the beginning, and we saw them on an ultrasound a lot earlier than most would. But, you know, we had a lot of different appointments. There was a lot of doctor's appointments. And but I went into preterm labor at 25 weeks.
Oh,
Wow.
my goodness.
Yes, so scary.
Oh.
I'll never forget the day I went to the doctor, and we thought it was just a regular checkup, and it turned out to not be. And I went on bed rest at that point for the remainder of the pregnancy so they could give the babies some more time to grow.
Yeah.
Because while they could have been viable, it would have been a very scary viability time frame for them at 25 weeks.
Sure.
And so I was on bed rest at 25 weeks.
Oh my gosh.
And it was, you know, at home bed rest at that point. But then again, at 30 weeks, I was already starting to dilate. And so they put me in the hospital for 2 weeks of bed rest in the hospital. That was far worse than home bed rest.
Yeah.
You know, you do what you have to do to keep them in there as long as possible.
Definitely.
And you'll endure anything. And I don't think I realized at that point that while I was willing to endure anything in order to give them the best chance at life, how much that mirrored what I was going to have to do once they came.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so at 30 weeks, we were in the hospital for 2. At 32 weeks, they let me go home again. I basically begged them, I will sit on the couch. I won't do anything.
Yeah.
Please let me go home.
Yeah.
And they did. And I'll never forget the day that they were born. It was a Saturday. I think I remember this almost so vividly. Like, it's just so vivid for me. And I looked at my husband, and I was writing him a grocery list. And I looked at him and I said, I can't do this anymore. I'm done. I'm tired. And I just can't do this anymore. And an hour later, my water broke.
Oh, wow.
And I burst into tears. And he said, "Why are you crying about this?" And I said, "I didn't mean it. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean
Like you
it."
wished your water to break.
Yes,
Oh
right.
my gosh.
He's
But
like,
now it's real.
yeah, he's like, "Honey, that's not how this works.
Yeah, it's like
You didn't do this."
early onset mom guilt.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes,
For real.
absolutely.
Starts
But we were
early.
33 weeks at that point.
Okay.
Wow.
And so, you know, they were born 33 weeks, and labor and delivery was actually not that bad. It was quick for me.
Wow.
And so they came out at 4 pounds 2 ounces and 4 pounds 7 ounces, which for
okay.
33-week twins
Twins,
was
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
That is.
Yes. And so they went into the NICU, and they were basically feeders and growers at that point because their lungs were great. And so they were just learning how to eat and how to grow and gain some weight. They were only in for 2 weeks.
Wow.
Which was a complete God thing because it should have been much longer for them.
Yeah.
So we brought home 35-week-old twins.
Wow.
It was so scary.
I
Yes.
bet.
Yeah. Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit from the time of birth until, whenever you want to pick up on this story. But essentially, from what I have heard, you guys actually have an open adoption relationship with your daughter's biological mother, which is not who donated the embryos, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so this is hard for me to wrap my mind around, but I love it and would love if you could explain exactly what that means and just what open adoption looks like for you guys.
So it is hard for most people to wrap their head around, even though as adults we have been through biology class and we understand all of that.
Yeah.
But
we don't really remember.
Right.
Right.
It's still hard to wrap our heads around. But basically, the couple that we adopted them from, they had a donor egg, and that's how the embryos were created. And so initially, when we had a contract with them for open communication, it was with the couple that we adopted them from, and it wasn't with biological mom. But soon after we got pregnant, I think it was after the girls were actually born, the family contacted us and said, hey, we have a great relationship with her. She would love to have some contact with you and get some updates on how the girls are doing and pictures and emails.
Cool.
And they were like, would you be okay with this? And we said, absolutely, we would.
Yeah.
And so we started some conversations with her, and she was amazing. And we had a lot of great connections from our past that we weren't aware of, and just super cool God things that you can only explain through him. And so we started that relationship, and it morphed into what we have now, which is completely wonderful, but it's not what I thought it would be.
Yeah.
At first I thought we're just going to share some photos and some updates, and, we might meet somewhere neutral and go to a amusement park or something at some point.
Right.
But now we have this completely wonderful relationship with her, and my kids know who she is. And we have been very open with them from day one, with exactly how God brought them to our family. Of course, because there's a biology lesson that's involved with their story, we've had to do it in very age-appropriate ways.
Sure.
Yes.
And what we've done is at their birthday each year, we've just added another piece to their story to help them understand.
Oh, that's
and
cool.
the most recent piece was that this great person that you've had this connection with, that's our family now, she helped create you. She's part of who you are.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a good way to say that.
Yes, she's part of who you are. And so they know that. And so they have some siblings as well, which was another reason we wanted an open adoption. It's also the reason we chose to go through an agency. A lot of times, if you go through the agency, you can have those open communications and those relationships and the prior medical history and all of those different things that come along with adoption.
Yeah.
And that's what we wanted. And we wanted it not necessarily for our benefit, but for the kids' benefit and for the relationships with siblings and family going forward. And so now she comes here and visits us with her family. We spend holidays together.
I love it.
I know.
They came a couple years ago for Thanksgiving and spent Thanksgiving with us in our home. And my girls go and visit with them and spend some time in the summers with them. Wow. And it's just been such an added blessing to our family. And I can't fathom what life was like before we had this extended family.
That is so cool.
I seriously love it.
So the girls do go and visit in the summers with their biological mom. And sometimes I go with them and my husband goes with us, and it's a big family vacation. And then sometimes they go and we meet halfway and they stay with them. And
that is so cool. And how old are they now?
They're 8.5.
Okay.
But they went in 2014. It was the first time, actually, that we were going to stay at their home. And so I went with the twins, and we drove to where they live. And we got there on a Wednesday. And that night, I had gotten several phone calls from my husband and a friend of mine. And I ignored it because I was trying to take care of the kids and get settled. And we had just arrived in her home. And so I thought, I'll call them back when I put the kids to bed. And I kept getting phone calls, and I looked at her at one point. I said, "Can you help, get them to bed? I think I'm going to have to call someone back." And so I called my friend first. I don't know why I called my friend first and not my husband.
Oh my gosh. Listen, it's fine. It's fine.
I called her and she said, "Have you talked to your husband?" And I said, "No, you were the first one I called." And she said, "Call your husband." I said, "Okay." And so he said, a friend of ours had another friend, and her daughter had a little girl that she was not going to be able to keep, and she wanted to place her for adoption. And did we want her? And we, of course, said, absolutely, we want her.
Yeah.
And so the next day, I left and I drove back to Charlotte, and I left my twins with their biological mom. And I went back to Charlotte with my husband, and we picked up our daughter.
So funny.
That is crazy. What are the chances? I mean, did you ever imagine in a million years this is what your adoption journey would look like?
No,
Right.
not at all.
Yeah. I've never
when we were
even heard of
going,
such.
yes, and when we were going through the home study process, we're talking to the social worker, and she's, checking the boxes on the piece of paper, and she's like, "Are you okay with a surprise phone call?" And I said, "Well, I don't know what you mean." And she said, like a phone call, we have a baby that needs placement and needs a home. Are you okay with taking that baby overnight? And I said, "Well, of course we are, but that doesn't happen to families like mine. It happens in movies."
I felt the same way.
Right.
Happens in movies.
We know. Macy and I, that is all three of our stories.
And she's like, "No, that happens a lot."
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, of course we're okay with that. Check the box."
Yeah.
Right.
Not thinking it would ever happen.
Yeah.
Right.
And not thinking that your daughters would stay with their biological
Right.
mother. So cool.
Yes.
That is so cool. I know that you're really intentional about giving your girls space to just know their stories, process their stories like you talked about, talking with them at age appropriate levels. And obviously, they're still young. But how do you guys talk with them about their adoption?
Adoption is something that for our family it's just part of our dialogue
Yeah.
every day. I don't think there's a day that goes by that we don't in some way, shape, or form mention the word adoption and talk about it in some way.
Yeah.
And so because that's always been a day one conversation in our family, they don't think anything of it. This is just how God brought them to us.
Yeah.
And so we haven't had to, there wasn't this just one big moment where we just had to sit down and just say it. It's just
Definitely.
been their story, and we've just built on that. Because we feel like it's super important for them to know where they came from and how God brought them to us. They just because they were embryos and I was able to carry them, and we're thankful for that, they still have other parents.
Yeah.
And that's been super important for us, that even in this non-traditional type of adoption that we have, that they still have the right to know where they came from
Absolutely.
and to know their extended family.
Yes.
So that's been super important for us.
I
Yeah.
love that. I really commend you for just keeping the door open, being honest with them. I mean, that is so, so important.
Yeah, for sure. And I know every story is so different. And so people might be listening to the story right now. This is your story. This isn't necessarily what their story might look like. But, it could be. So if there are people listening who they're considering embryo adoption, they're just looking into it, researching, I don't know, is there anything that you would share with them before they really press the gas and go for it? Or what do you wish that you knew before you dove in?
I wish that what I tell people when I talk to them about it, I've talked to some people who have been interested in embryo adoption, and what I tell them is do a lot of research, do a lot of praying, of course.
Yeah.
But that adoption it's not a one size fits all. And it looks different for every person. And I also talk to people who have been, not everybody comes to the adoption table because of infertility.
Correct.
And that's great. But if you have come to the table with infertility towards adoption, that was something that for us, we had to grieve.
Yeah.
It's a loss. It's a loss of what we
Absolutely.
thought was going to be and is now not. And it's going to look different for us. And that's okay. But it was definitely something we had to work through before we moved forward with anything else. And so I always encourage them, if they came to the table of adoption with infertility, work through that.
Yeah.
That's
Absolutely
very
work
wise.
through that. But that, I want people to know more about embryo adoption. I also want people to know that it's okay to want to experience pregnancy.
Yes.
It's okay to want to experience birth. It's okay to want to experience all those things. You can allow yourself that. I think that sometimes that we feel like that's a selfish thing, and there's so many babies that needs kids in general that need homes.
Yeah.
Loving homes, that we feel it's a little selfish to want some of those things that traditional families have, and that's okay to want that.
Yeah.
So
That's
I also
really
tell them
good.
it's okay.
That's awesome, for sure. Well, I'm so glad you got to share your story with us, and just I've learned so much even just from listening to it. Is there anything else that you want to add?
I don't know that there is. One of the things you had talked a little bit about, some of the reasons that people choose embryo adoption. One of the other reasons that we felt like this was something we needed to at least explore was there are so many frozen babies in this country right now. At the time that we did this 9 years ago, there was approximately 400,000 frozen babies.
I had no idea.
Yes.
Wow.
And now, not all of them are, some couples are still using those embryos for sure. But some of them are up for adoption.
Yeah.
Wow.
And we wanted to just be able to, if we could, give some of them a chance at life. And so that was another reason that we decided this was something we wanted to try.
That is so awesome.
I love it.
Wow.
We hope you've enjoyed listening and learning. If you haven't already, it would mean so much if you'd leave us an honest review before you go. You can connect with us on social media at AdoptWell and find more helpful resources in the show notes. You can also find our blog online at www.adoptwell.com. We look forward to spending more time with you in the future as we all learn together how we can adopt well.